Anything else? Some soda?
No, just water's great. Thank you. And will this amplify me, or do I have to have to use that?
That's just for the video.
Okay.
I can monitor how you're speaking and boost you up a little bit if you need it, or down.
Yeah, because I don't normally stand behind a lectern.
So yes, it is a wireless mic. If you want to pull it off the podium there, you can walk around with it.
Okay.
Do you know, is any part of your presentation like a question and answer, or is it all presentation?
No, there will be talks where it's very interactive, where people talk at their tables, where people get up and walk around and do things, but there won't be a question.
So, like, in other words, we have the podium and you mic'd, but none of the crowd is mic'd. So is there any time that we're going to need to hear what they're saying? Like if they're talking in small groups amongst themselves, we don't have to hear that. But if they need to say something to the whole group.
No, there's no time that they'll be saying something to the whole group.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
So just be aware that if something does come up naturally, that somebody says something, just kind of repeat it back, because probably people in the back will hear it and you can't hear it all.
Yeah. We're not going to do that.
Cool.
Is this turned off so I can go to the restroom?
Yeah, we have it off on this end.
Okay.
So.
All right.
All right. How's the day going so far? Oh, so like 3 people are having a good time. Okay, a couple more. I see thumbs up in the back. Awesome. Well, we saved the best for last, if it can get any better. I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, who is Dr. Ron Richhart, who's a senior research associate and principal investigator at Harvard Project Zero. His talk today is on creating a culture of thinking right from the start. 10 things to say every day to your students and why they matter. The reason that we asked Dr. Richhart to speak today is that what his work personally and the work of his team at Project Zero is something that's going to continue to redefine our profession for the rest of my life, and I think the rest of everyone else's life here. It's focused on how we enculturate the skills to create the dispositions that we all want to have in our kids, the kind of kids that we want to be as adults. When we think of these kids down the road, what the gift that we've given them, how do we do that? How do we enact it? And so I'm going to welcome Dr. Richhart here and let him take the rest of the time here with you all. Quick note, you're going to need a sheet of paper that's in the center of your table as part of the keynote address. If you don't have one or you'd like an electronic copy, you can go to the resources section. If you go to teach.noadam.com for the resources from the different presenters today, it's in the Dropbox as well, okay? So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Richhart.
Great, thank you. So I've titled this talk, Creating a Culture of Thinking Right from the Start, because we do create culture in our classrooms from that very first moment that our students arrive. But also, it is important that we get that culture right. One of the kind of long-standing findings from educational research is one of the best predictors how any day in the school year will go is how that first week goes. So we establish that culture, but the good news is that we also continue to shape that culture and continue to move that forward. And I think that culture is something we don't talk a lot about in schools, that we tend to, all over the world, when policymakers want to improve education, they change the curriculum. And I think that that comes from a somewhat naive place. It's not that curriculum is unimportant, but I think the place that it comes from is that policymakers often think that all teachers do is deliver curriculum. And I like to say we are not so much deliverers of curriculum as we are the ones that enact curriculum. We are the ones that breathe life into that. And so any curriculum, any lesson, any unit, good or bad, will sink or float based on the culture of that classroom. And again, we don't spend much time talking about the mechanisms of building that culture. University folks, when they want to improve education, they tend to focus on instruction, new methods about delivering that curriculum. Now, curriculum is important, instruction is important, but the third leg of that stool is the culture. So that's what we're going to explore today. So to begin with, I'd like for you to think about something that you did. If you could identify 3 things that you did at the beginning of this school year, that you did those because you thought, this is important. This is going to be useful in terms of creating the culture in my classroom. Give you a moment. There's some pads of paper at your table. I know I probably have something else to write with, but would you write down 3 things that you did at the beginning of that first week of the school year that helped to build and create that culture? I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, so here's what we're going to do with that list of 3 things that you did at the beginning of the school year, that first week to help build culture. We're going to do a thinking routine, and this routine is called Give One, Get One. And the way that this works, in just a moment, we're all going to stand up. I'm going to ask you to find someone in the room not at your table, introduce yourself to that person, and you're going to give them one of the ideas that you wrote down. But most importantly, and what makes this a thinking routine, is that when you give this person one of the routines that or one of the ideas that you've written down, you need to explain why that was useful. How did that help to build and create culture in your classroom? They will write down your idea and they will repeat the process. They will give you one of their ideas and explaining how that helped to build culture. You will then thank that person, and then you'll go and find someone else in the room who you don't know, introduce yourself to that person, and then repeat that process. Each time giving one of your ideas, but then also explaining why and how that helped to create culture. So just a few restrictions on the giving and the getting. So the first one I mentioned, no one at your table. So seek out people and no one who would have been in your classroom. So try to get people who you don't know from other schools, other places, to share those ideas. A second restriction is that when you go up to your first person, if you give them your idea and they say, you know what? I do the same thing. I wrote down that same thing. Then you actually have not given them something. So you need to check that out. So if the person says, I do that as well, or I wrote that down, then give them something else off your list so that it's a new idea for them. So you'll need to kind of check that with. Okay? So stand up, and once you've done this 3 times, then head back to your table. So stand up, give one, get one.
Okay, good.
One more friend. All right.
Okay, so would you finish the exchange you're on? And once you're finished with that exchange, head back to your table, please. You did that really well. So, but we're not done with that list yet. We're going to do several other things with that right now. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do with that list, would you look at the new ideas you got in the give one, get one exchange, pick your favorite new idea, something that you say, that's a really cool thing to do. That's something that I should do in my classroom, and share that with your neighbors. So just pair up, rather than doing this as a whole table, just pair up with another person, or if the numbers work out, have a group of 3 at your table and share your favorite new idea. But again, the most important thing is you have to explain, what is it about that that really appeals to you, that you think would be useful in your classroom? Yeah. Favorite thing, share with your neighbor. Hey, if you would take about another 30 seconds in those conversations. Well, hopefully there in the give one, get one exchange, and just even the sharing that you've just done now, you've got some useful kind of ideas of activities, things that you might do at the beginning of the year to help kind of build culture. But culture goes much deeper than just any kind of set of activities, as good as they might be. And so we want to now kind of connect those activities to the idea of how is it that we actually build culture. And we do that through what I call a set of cultural forces. And these emerged from some research that I did. I spent a year studying classrooms where teachers were really adept at getting students to think, of understanding how they went about this process. And this framework for kind of understanding culture emerged from that research. And I chose to call these forces because just like the force of gravity, you don't wake up in the morning and decide, do I want gravity today or not? You just have to deal with it. By the same token, you don't decide whether you want these forces in your classroom or in your school. They are already there. They're in every group, every organization, every classroom, every school. The question is, how will we leverage these to build culture? So in no particular order here, routines. So all groups have routines and structures. And one way of thinking about what a routine can be thought of as, this is how we do things here. So at the beginning of the year, we pay a lot of attention to helping students understand, well, how will we do things in this classroom? How will we go about the process of inquiry, of exploration, of discussion, of building understanding, of learning together, of discussing, establishing those routines and structures. Next one is time. So all groups have a limited amount of time. All people have a limited amount of time. We as teachers are always aware of that limited amount of time. And in fact, it's been said that one of the things that makes teaching a high stress occupation is that we have to make so many decisions about time. We all have that clock in our head. How long before the bell is going to ring? How long before I have to send kids out? And so if you think about it, well, how is it that you can make those decisions about time? It's based on your values. It's based on what you think is important. And our students pick up on that. What do we give time to, and what do we take time away from? And so time is sending messages to our students about what we value, about what we think is important. Next one, opportunities. Now, the language that we often use to talk about what we do as teachers is we use the language of lessons, plans, units, activities, tasks. But if you boil all of that down, what we really are doing is we are creating opportunities. Opportunities, again, to build understanding, opportunities for curiosity, opportunities to challenge misconceptions. So what kinds of opportunities are we providing our students with? And that research I did in classrooms, one of the things that struck me about all these teachers who were so incredibly good at getting students to think, from that first day when they had students, they jumped into a big and rich learning opportunity that provided a kind of touchstone for the rest of the year about how they would learn, about what learning would look like. And so think about those opportunities. And in comparison, some of the other classrooms that I looked at, teachers laid out all of the rules, went through that, and students were experiencing the same thing over and over again. And what they were getting was the message, this is just going to be the same as usual. So if you're wanting to establish a different culture, a different story of learning, the opportunities that you present early on will send a message to the student about what is this school year going to be like. And I think that every student, regardless of age, regardless of culture, regardless of background, comes to school the very first day with the exact same question. And that question is, what is it going to feel like to be a learner in this classroom? And we answer that right away from those first days and weeks. The next one, modeling. So modeling comes in lots of different forms. And one form of modeling that we would all be familiar with as teachers is what would be called instructional modeling. And instructional modeling is when we stand in front of a group and we say, now watch me, I'm going to show you how to do something. And instructional modeling is really useful for learning a process or learning a skill. But as a cultural force, it is not so much the instructional modeling we're talking about as it is dispositional modeling, the modeling of who we are as thinkers and learners. Ted Sizer, who was a dean at Harvard Graduate School of Education, started the Coalition of Essential Schools. He ended his career here in Massachusetts being the head of a secondary school. And the last book that he wrote with his wife, Nancy, the title of it was The Students Are Watching. It's all about the fact that students of every age know they are growing into adulthood. This isn't a mystery, even to the youngest student. It may seem a very long way away, but they know one day they will be adults. So they are paying attention to the adults in their life. So they were always watching us. Now, that instructional modeling has an on-off switch, because we literally say with instructional modeling, now watch me, I'm going to show you something. Dispositional modeling, there is no off switch. It is always on. So are we displaying our passion, our curiosity? Do we show our students how we take risks and learn from mistakes? So thinking about what is it that we are a model of for our students. Next one, interactions. So the way that we interact with our students, the way that our students interact with one another. I've never ever been in a classroom where student-to-student interactions were any better than teacher-to-student interactions. And so again, we're models of that. And what we also can't assume, particularly as we get a new group of students, is that they will just know how to interact with one another. Again, we have to develop structures and routines that facilitate those interactions. The next one, the environment. At the beginning of the school year, we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about the physical environment and setting that up. We think about what is up on the wall. Now, as teachers, it takes time to do all that. And so again, that is sending our students a lot of information, a lot of messages about what learning will look like. one of the things, we're at a kind of conference center today, but we've all been at events at other schools where we've had conferences. And one of the things that we like to do as teachers, we like to walk down the hallway and we like to peek into classrooms. And if you think about it, we're peeking into empty classrooms. Why are we doing that? It's because we can tell a lot about the learning that happens in a space just by what's on the wall, just by the way a room is set up. We can tell which rooms seem inviting, which rooms seem energetic, which rooms have a passion and a curiosity about them. So the physical environment. The next one, language. So language is our prime vehicle of instruction, so we're always using language. But language operates in many, many subtle ways. For example, something as simple as a teacher's use of pronouns. So do we talk about what we are going to do, our learning? So we can be inclusive, we are us, or it could be more directive and more distancing, what I want you to do in your job and your task. And it's not that you don't use I and you, because many instances require that, and it's not bad in any way, but we just recognize I and you creates distance. Whenever we can use that collective of we or our, we are sending a signal that we are learners with our students, and that what we are engaged in is a collective enterprise of learning together and building that understanding. We're going to delve a little bit more into that cultural force of language in a little bit. And then the last one, expectations. Now, this is also a word that gets used all the time in education, gets used in kind of slightly different ways. And the most common way that we use that word expectations is we talk about our expectations of our students. I expect you to be on time. I expect you to be prepared. I expect this on this assignment. Those are all things that we want from our students. Nothing wrong with our expectations of our students, but we do have to recognize the expectations of another human being, whether it be our students or whether it be our spouse or whether it be our colleagues, expectations of other people are basically cheap. I mean, they don't cost us anything. It's just what we want. As a cultural force, it is not so much our expectations of our students as it is our expectation for our students. What do we want for them? So you can kind of hear a difference here. If I were to say, I have an expectation of independence in my classroom, that just means I expect you to come in and be independent. But if I have an expectation for independence, that means I see a role for me as the teacher and a role for you as a student and an expectation of growth over time. So when we have those expectations for our students, they are really pointing a direction and a roadmap that guide us. So these 8 cultural forces, these are the building blocks of culture. And again, the good news is you don't have to worry about inserting any of these tomorrow in your classroom. They're already there. By the same token, you can never, ever take any of these out. You can't show up to school one day and you say, you know what, no interactions for me today. I just won't have an environment, not going to work for you very well. So your only question is really, how will you leverage these? How will you use these as the building blocks of culture? So thinking about those 8 cultural forces, I'm going to ask you once again to return to the list that you got in the Get One exchange. And again, pair up with a partner, but now go through the entire list. Go through both the ones that you wrote down initially as well as the new ones you got. And as you're looking at those activities and those actions, think about how did they connect to these 8 cultural forces. Was that an action that, that's really around interactions, that's really around routines. So make that connection between the 8 cultural forces and that list of actions that you have. And again, we'll take about 5 minutes for that discussion at your table. Okay, if you would take about 1 more minute at your table, 1 more minute. Okay, so let's come back together here. Yeah, one thing, and certainly, I asked you to write down 3 things, so you weren't writing down everything that you did at the beginning of the year. You're just writing down a few things. But in using and thinking about these 8 cultural forces, one thing that frequently happens as people kind of do what you just did is they recognize, at the beginning of the school year, I did spend a lot of time thinking about the routines and introducing routines and those structures. I spent a lot of time thinking about the environment and setting that up and really beginning to establish interactions and say some norms for our classroom. But I hadn't really thought that much about my use of language, or hadn't really thought that much about what I'm modeling that first week. So where you may recognize some gaps, then begin to kind of pay attention to that. Well, what kinds of things might you do? And again, those are really important at that first week of school in terms of establishing culture, but we are always attending to these 8 cultural forces every day of the school year. And so thinking about as we create a really strong and supportive and powerful culture that really supports our students as thinkers and learners, we want to constantly be attending to these, and how are they playing out in our classrooms? What are the messages we are sending through our use of these 8 cultural forces? What can our students tell about what is important and what is valuable in our classroom? So we're going to take one of those, again, the cultural force of language, and really begin to kind of zero into that, because our words do matter. And one thing that I find kind of really useful is to ask your students, what is it that they hear you saying over and over again? You could ask your last year students at this point in the school year. You can ask this year's students. Lots of nervous laughter is good. So I remember a while back when I posed this question. Someone came up to me afterwards and said, if you ask my students what I say repeatedly, what they would say is, "Where's your pencil?" And I said, "Well, do you really care about pencils?" And she says, "No, it's really about being prepared for your learning." And then a light bulb went off. That's what I need to be saying. I really want to communicate, not that I care about pencils, but that I want them being prepared for their learning. And so she recognized, what do I really want to say? And so whatever our students are hearing us say over and over again, they're picking up on that we care a lot about that. That's important to us. So our words matter in terms of what is it that we are saying. They become kind of a through line for our teaching. And again, our students can tell us this. What do they hear us saying over and over? But in this second half, then again, kind of zeroing in on language, I'm going to share with you 10 things that I think are important to say to our students every day. And this is the handout that's at your paper, so you won't necessarily need to take notes. Those are kind of a reference thing if you want to follow along. Well, I'm going to talk about these and about why they are important. We'll go through them kind of one at a time. So the first one, hello and goodbye. Greeting every student every day, making sure that we make that acknowledgement. That every student, even that shy student, even the student that seems to be kind of trying to fly under the radar, desperately wants to be seen and noticed. And we know why this sometimes doesn't happen, why we don't say hello and goodbye to our students kind of every single day, every single class period, is because of time. The bell's just rung, I've got to get ready for the next class, I'm doing this, I'm preparing things, I'm pulling out materials. But this is incredibly important. It's probably one of the simplest but high leverage practice there is. A study that just came out last year looking at greeting middle school students. So middle school teachers, you know, they've got lots of different students. They've got periods, students coming in. What they found was when a teacher greeted students at the door every day, that misbehavior went down by 9% and engagement went up by 20%. Just from a simple greeting at the door. So if you could think about that, you could do this. And what they said, kind of looking at this on a school-wide basis, this was the equivalent of adding an extra hour onto the school day. So when you think about, yes, it takes time to stand there, but when you think about what the benefits are for us to actually greet our students, to acknowledge them, to see, because it's much easier to misbehave when you feel you're anonymous, when you feel like the teacher doesn't know you, when you haven't made that connection. And it's also easier to be engaged when you feel like the teacher does recognize you and does see you kind of as an individual. So making sure we say hello and goodbye to our students. Number 2 on the list. Now this is an acronym. It's one of the earliest thinking routines that we developed, and the acronym stands for, what makes you say that? Following up when a student gives a response with, well, what makes you say that? Showing that we are interested in their thinking. We are curious about what lies behind that answer. When we were developing these ideas of the thinking routines, we were working in Sweden at the time, and the Swedish teachers took to calling this the magic question. Because they said, all you have to do is ask, what makes you say that? And then so much comes out of our students' minds, so much that we weren't expecting. And we did a lot of research in Australia, and one of the secondary teachers there at the end of the project, she says, you know that what makes you say that? She says, that's not just for the classroom. She said, that's how I live my life now. She said, I used to be really shy at like cocktail parties and things. And I found if you just listen to people and you say, well, what makes you say that? All of a sudden you sound so interesting and the conversation just picks up. And she said, and it saved my marriage. She said, I used to get in all these fights with my husband. He would say things and I would get really mad and frustrated and respond back. And I realized when he says something, if I just say, well, what makes you say that? The words coming out of his mouth were totally different from what I was hearing. So she says, it saved my marriage. Now, don't be surprised, though, if you start using what makes you say that on your students or on your own children, if they don't start using it back on you as well, too. So be prepared for that one. The next one, talk to me about what you're doing. Now, this is a metacognitive prompt. It's a chance for students to explain their process, to explain their thinking. And one of the ways that we develop metacognition is we first externalize that process. And so when someone asks us, well, talk to me about what you're doing. This isn't a kind of confrontational thing. It's a curiosity prompt again. Then students will begin to explain their thinking. They may actually recognize, that's an error. That's not right. I need to change that plan. That process of externalizing their thinking gives them the chance to review their thinking. And gradually, that process becomes internalized. And so they can become more metacognitive independently as well. And also when we're asking our students to talk with us about what they're doing, it's giving us formative information, formative assessment information that helps us then see where a student is at and to plan our instruction more effectively. Number 4, here's where we're going with this. So all over the world, many teachers and districts and things are often told, you need to start every lesson by stating the objective, by stating the learning intention. Now, the research isn't really around stating objectives or stating intentions. The research that is based on is the research around purpose. that when learners have a sense of purpose, learning goes way up. But what happens all the time in the learning sciences and in psychological research is when something like that is uncovered, a policymaker will take that and turn it into an easy to implement policy and say, every teacher now needs to state the learning intention. But it's important to recognize that research isn't there on learning intentions, the research is on purpose. And so it's not that a learning intention or an objective is a bad thing to do, but I think many times it is just a naive thing to do, because it is not some magic powder that we sprinkle over our students. It's not some kind of inoculation. So it could be a part of purpose, but it isn't the same thing as purpose. And too often, when a teacher states a learning objective, all students hear is blah, blah, blah. This is just teacher speak. It's a pro forma at the beginning of the lesson. So what we have to recognize is, well, where's the purpose? And I think an easier way to get that is, here's where we're going with this. Help students to understand the bigger picture. What is it that we are trying to do? How does this link to what we were doing yesterday? How does this fit in terms of a learning trajectory for us? So always establishing that purpose for our students. Next one, here's the thinking you'll need to do. There's a real tendency for us as teachers that when we explain a new assignment or a new project or a new task, we often explain it in terms of the work components. You're going to need to, get 3 resources. You're going to kind of have a title page. You're going to need to do this. You're going to find a partner. And we explain all of the work. But the problem is, merely doing the work, merely doing those logistical things are not where the learning resides. The learning resides in the thinking. So we need to get used to leading with the thinking we'll do. On this assignment, you're going to be presenting an argument. So you're going to need to pull together things from different perspectives. Therefore, you'll need to find at least 3 different resources. So the work components come out of the thinking, but getting used to leading with the thinking. So we're at number 5 here. So we're going to take a little break to kind of zero in more on what does it mean to talk about the thinking. The last page of your handout has what we call 8 thinking moves. And we call that document the understanding map. So early on, when we were developing our research around teaching for understanding and our research around the thinking routines, we said, the thinking that leads to understanding is particularly important in schools and for our students. So we tried to identify for ourselves not the longest list of thinking imaginable, but actually the shortest list. And our test was, are these necessary for understanding? Do we have to have these to say that we have understanding? And so we identified 8. My version here is a little bit different than yours. If you like this version, if you just Google understanding map, it's the first image that kind of comes up there. And so kind of going through these, and as I go through these and talk a little bit about them, you'll recognize that some of these also are quite prominent in the next generation science standards as well too. So the idea of building explanations. So often when we are trying to understand something, we are trying to explain, we are trying to interpret, we are trying to build a hypothesis around that. So we felt that building explanations was an important component. Describing what's there. So this actually is one of the foundations of analysis, that in order to analyze, we have to identify the various parts and pieces and think about kind of what's going on and breaking it down. And also in that ability to describe what's there is the ability to see and to notice. And far from being simple, that ability to see and notice is one of the ways that we tend to recognize expertise and understanding. That someone with expertise is able to see and notice things that a novice would miss. So we think that our historian could look at a painting and see and notice things that we might not be able to. Our doctor can look at an X-ray and see and notice things we aren't able to. Wondering. So again, that ability to ask questions, again, one of those connections to the next generation science standards. Now, wondering is a really interesting one also just think about in terms of the role it plays in understanding. So as human beings, as adults, you all can think of multiple times, I'm sure, every single day in which you gained new knowledge, new information without asking a single question. Because you can read something, you can listen to something, you can watch something. So you can easily get new information and knowledge without asking any questions. But I think you would be hard-pressed to think of a time where you developed understanding and didn't ask a single question. Even if that question is just rolling around in your head, how does this fit? How might I use this? How does this connect? You're asking those questions. And so what it tells us is that knowledge and information can be, not that they have to be, but they can be a passive enterprise. Understanding can't be. Understanding is always an active process. We always bring ourselves to every moment of understanding. And so those questions are incredibly important for us. Considering different viewpoints and perspectives. So if there is an issue that we are trying to understand and we have only looked at that issue from a single perspective, we recognize our understanding is limited, that with additional perspectives, we gain understanding. Reasoning with evidence, another big connection there. So as we are building understanding, we are using the information, we are using our experience, we are using our data to help us to build that understanding. Making connections. This too is also one of those big separators between knowledge and understanding. And one of the ways that people sometimes talk about the difference between understanding and knowledge is understanding is connected knowledge. And that's why teaching for understanding is so incredibly useful. And because it doesn't neglect knowledge in any way, but it focuses more on the connections. And two things happen when knowledge is connected. It makes it easier to retain. It also makes it easier to apply. Those are the two things that are needed for students to do well on standardized tests: retention and transfer. And so when we teach for understanding and help students to make those connections, we are helping them and actually preparing them that deeper understanding. Even when the test is just a test of knowledge, students do better. The next one, uncovering complexities. The idea that understanding is an in-depth endeavor. It's not a surface enterprise. And we even have everyday language. We say, oh, I've just skimmed the surface. We haven't gone very deeply. So we recognize that understanding, there's always more that we're always able to see. And the last one, capture the heart in forming conclusions, which sounds like a very concluding and ending task. And we do often do that as teachers at the end of a unit, trying to sum everything up. But the way that our minds work is our minds actually can't delay this. Our minds are always engaged in the process of distillation. What is this? How do I understand this now? And a good example of that is when we are reading a novel and a new character gets introduced. We form an opinion of that character right away based on the information we have. What you can't do as a reader is you can't say, oh, a new character has just been introduced. I won't think anything about this character until the very end because I want all the information. Your mind can't do that. Your mind has to form some kind of conclusion, even though it holds it tentatively, even though you know it will change. And so we're always engaged in that process of distilling. So we said that these 8 thinking moves were really necessary for understanding. And to the extent that's true, I point out several ways in which this can be really useful. So we want to kind of lead with the kind of thinking we want students to do. It also then is really useful when we are planning our units, because you wouldn't necessarily do all of these in a single lesson, but over the course of a unit, you really can do all of these. You can make sure that students are engaged in all of these kinds of thinking. And a typical way that teachers all over the world plan is we plan by pulling out last year's unit. And we make revisions, and we make changes, and we make tweaks. And so when we're doing that, looking at that and saying, well, where's the thinking in this lesson? And sometimes we recognize in a unit, we may say, in this unit, we've raised lots of questions. We were building explanations. We've really kind of made lots of connections. We were always reasoning with evidence. Oh, we haven't done anything with different perspectives. How might we bring that in? So sometimes we recognize there's a gap. And another way that happens when teachers kind of do that review of their unit plans is they recognize, I've got this activity that the kids really love, but there's no thinking involved. It doesn't mean throw it out, but it means how can you kind of bump that up so that there is thinking involved there. So spend a couple of minutes at your table or with your partner, talk about kind of how you might find this understanding map useful to you in your teaching. Okay, if you would take about 30 more seconds in your conversations. Okay, and if you'd wrap up those conversations, let's come back together. So the understanding map that you have in front of you, as I said, it's a little bit more updated. It's not necessarily better. One of the nice things about the circular graphic is it communicates that there's no beginning and no end. As soon as you put things in a list, it seems like there's a top and a bottom. There really isn't. You can start anywhere. All of them are important. There's no hierarchy there. One of the nice things about that list version that you have there is we did create icons with that. And so a lot of teachers use those icons. They find them particularly useful with younger students or with second language learners. And some teachers have taken those, kind of blown them up, laminated them, put magnets on them. And then on their daily schedule, they use those magnets to indicate what kind of thinking we're going to be doing today in each of the various lessons we have. So that can be really useful for yourself as well as for your students, is making that connection. Another thing with this is that we have this map in about 10 different languages. So we have it in Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, Indonesian, Catalan, soon Korea. Those are all available on my website, which is just my name, ronrichard.com, and just a free download there. So if you're interested in different language versions, like I said, about 10 different languages there. So back to our 10 things to say every day. We're up to number 6 there. So let's debrief. The most neglected part of any lesson is the close. And again, we know why that is, because we run out of time. But again, one of the things that research has shown us is new learning is incredibly fragile. We can have a lesson that we think is just amazing, and we feel like, so much understanding, there was so much thinking, it was really good. And then what happens? The kids run off to the next class. They go out to recess, they go off to lunch. And we've all had that experience as a teacher. We've explained, say, a homework assignment or task, and we've done a really good job of explaining it. And we've said, are there any questions? There are no questions. And then they go home, and then we start getting phone calls, and we start getting emails. And it's because it made perfect sense at the time, but now, 2 hours later, it's all gone. So having that opportunity to debrief, to consolidate, and it doesn't have to take a lot of time. So I think one of the sessions I was in this morning, someone was modeling using exit tickets. And an exit ticket is a good way of kind of debriefing because it allows students to kind of do that synthesis of pulling things together. It can be, there's another routine we call the headlines routine, stating very simply, sum up your learning in a headline. What would that be? That can be an exit ticket or as students leave the classroom. So we also can be the person that pulls things together by telling our students, here's what I noticed, here's where people were raising questions, here where people were getting stuck, here's where some new understanding was been. So we can begin to do that. We can document that so it carries forward into the next lesson. So number 7, I've noticed. And I would contrast this particular expression with one that I think we should use less often, and that is, I liked. I really liked how you, I really like how. The problem with I liked is when we use I like, we are flipping attention from the object that we're trying to focus on to ourselves. And now school becomes about pleasing the teacher. Am I pleasing the teacher? But when you begin to say, I noticed, then there's the opportunity to discuss, to explore, for the student to kind of share. You are raising awareness of the features of what's going on and beginning to talk about those rather than merely in a pleasing way, in a way that they can be analyzed and discussed and explored further. Number 8, I already talked about this one, the power of we. So whenever we can use that plural, the we, our, us, Another pronoun, again, like I said, I and you, there's nothing wrong with I and you because many instances just require it. I mean, you can't come into class and say, you know, last night when we were planning, we decided, just going to sound weird, you know, you were the person doing that. So there are many instances in which it's not bad. But another pronoun actually to watch out for in the classroom is they. What do you think they want in this question? What do you think they are asking? When you use they, you are then putting authority in your classroom to this anonymous person that doesn't exist outside of you. Your classroom is your culture. So how are we making sense of this? What do we think this means rather than attributing it to a they, this anonymous source that's out there? So number 9, I'm sorry. Now, this isn't about falling on your sword. It's just about recognizing that we all make mistakes and that we want our students to see that we make mistakes, that we learn from those mistakes, and that we take responsibility for them, and that taking responsibility is no big deal. So we can come and say, you know, that lesson yesterday, I'm sorry, it didn't work out the way that I had it envisioned in my mind. So here's how I'm changing that. When our students see that we take responsibility for our actions and we move forward with that, they then are able to begin to take responsibility for their actions and claim them and move forward. So we have to normalize that process of this is just what it means to be human. We make mistakes, we accept responsibility, and we move forward. And number 10, wow. Give your students an opportunity to surprise you. One of the things when I'm observing in a classroom and debriefing with a teacher afterwards, a question I often ask is, well, what surprised you in that lesson? And if a teacher says nothing, I think 2 things happened. One is either the lesson was so constrained and so narrow, there was no opportunity for students to actually surprise us, to do something interesting, to do something original or novel, or we just weren't paying attention. Because with 25, 30, 35 kids in a classroom, all these different minds thinking and exploring, there should be surprises. And we should be on the alert for them. And those surprises are one of the things that makes teaching exciting, when our students surprise us about what things are happening that we hadn't expected. Those are great opportunities for us, and those are things that really spur the learning forward. So let me put all of these kind of back up there. So those 10 things, and no doubt, many of these are already in your vocabulary. You may use slightly different words than what I have, but take just a couple of minutes and get at your table or with a partner there, talk about which ones are already kind of in your vocabulary, which ones are things that you do already say, and which ones perhaps, I hadn't really thought about that. I'd like to start using that. So again, about 2 minutes at your tables to talk about those. Okay, and once again, let's come back together. So one thing I would encourage you to do with these 10 things to say every day is just to keep this list on your desk. Just kind of review it first thing in the morning, review it again, at lunch, review it at the end of the day. And then gradually these will become kind of more natural for you. But in closing here, I want to end with a bonus. So in addition to those 10 things to say, one additional note is to say nothing. Teachers take up an enormous amount of airtime in the classroom. Most estimates are around 70 to 80% of the talk that happens in classrooms is done by the teacher. If we recognize that a lot of our ability to build understanding comes through our conversation, comes from our discussion, we have to pull back on that talk time. We have to talk less. And a very useful acronym that can help us is this one, WAIT. And WAIT stands for, why am I talking? So ask yourself, is this something that the students can be talking? Is it something they can be discussing? Do I have to be the one talking? So in closing there, and with those 10 things, hope you use those to take them forward in the school year and continue to have a very successful year of learning for both you and your students. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. I just want to say again, a big thanks to Dr. Richard. It was such a treat to have him here. All the way from New Mexico, right?
Yes.
And on his way to Europe tonight. So we really got lucky. And I would encourage you to go on Amazon. I was not asked to plug any books. I have to say though, if I haven't given you one, because I love these books, please go on Amazon and check out Creating a Culture of Thinking. It's the 8 Cultural Forces. Just put in Dr. Richard's name, and I think he's got a new one coming out too. Anyhow, a couple quick housekeeping notes. On your way out, please check around you, make sure that you don't have any cell phones or anything behind, because this room is going to get flipped over. Outside the main doors, there are some little goodies for you to take. Feel free to pick something, take it. And also your PDP certificates or your CEUs are out there. Look for the one with your name. And otherwise, thank you so much for coming. We hope that you had a great time. And keep an eye on your email for a feedback link. All right, take care. Thank you.
Before I leave,
Yes.
Nice to meet you.
You too.
My assistant principal just got me your book,
Oh, okay.
So-
Where do you teach at?
Impact Prep in Springfield.
Okay, great.
So not too far from here, but
Oh, fantastic.
yeah.
Good.
Thank you for being
Okay.
here. I learned
Oh,
a lot. Appreciate
Thank you.
it.
Great.
You know,
Hi.
I'm totally geeking out and wanted to like ask you to sign
Oh,
my
I'd be
book.
very
And I
happy
was sitting
to.
up there at the front, and
And your
Francis
name is
Pompey's
not
Kristen.
free Wi-Fi,
No,
but Kristen. And what do you teach, Kristen?
at the Lake School in Lawrence.
Okay, and it's with an E. Yep.
Yes,
Good.
I've started to read, so I was excited that you were the guest speaker
Great.
today. So it's definitely a lot of things to think about.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that makes teaching so complex, is there?
Yes. Yes. You did.
There we go,
Thank
Kristen.
you.
Great.
Thank you so
Great.
much.
My
I
pleasure.
appreciate it.
Great. Nice meeting you.
Perfect. Thank you.